Part 1. The Dawn of Tenochtitlan. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Tonight, we begin with a civilization that, in its own time, thought it could basically rewrite the rules of the universe. So dim the lights, grab a pillow if you like, and let's float gently into the sticky, sun-drenched world of the Aztecs. A world of bustling markets, sprawling temples, and, well, a surprising amount of political backstabbing, because apparently some things never change. Now, when we say Aztec, most of us picture enormous pyramids, intricate feathered headdresses, and yes, the occasional human sacrifice. But before they were famous for all of that, and before the Spanish showed up to really ruin everyone's day, they were just a bunch of wandering Mexica people trying to find a home. And not just any home. They were looking for a place where an eagle, perched on a cactus and holding a snake in its beak, would appear. Which, if you stop and think about it, is a pretty demanding real estate requirement. But they were dedicated, and apparently the universe had a sense of humor because eventually they found it. This was in 1325, on a swampy island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. You can imagine the conversation. So, it's wet. Very wet. Are we sure about this? And yet they went ahead anyway. They built Tenochtitlan, which, if you measure by ambition and architectural audacity, was basically the Manhattan of the 14th century. Canals instead of streets, floating gardens, massive marketplaces where you could buy everything from cacao beans to exotic birds. It was impressive, and probably smelled like a swamp, but still. The Mexica were nothing if not resourceful. They were, however, also kind of intense. Their religion revolved around keeping the universe in balance, which meant a lot of ritual, and yes, the occasional human offering. They believed that if the sun didn't get its due, the world might just end, which is one way to ensure people never forget your birthday, I suppose. But before we get too deep into the sacrifices and temple building, because that stuff comes later, let's pause to appreciate the early Aztec rulers, the Tlatoani, which is basically a fancy title for king, although it's slightly more personal risk. Early on, these rulers were mostly just trying to survive, consolidate power, and not get eaten by more powerful neighbors. One of the first rulers we hear much about was Acamapichli. Charming guy. And by charming, I mean politically useful. He had multiple wives, as any ambitious ruler did, which helped him forge alliances across the region. And naturally, the dynastic game was brutal. Imagine your family tree being part genealogy, part corporate merger. It's all politics, but with more feathers and ceremonial spears. Now, Tenochtitlan grew quickly, which is impressive because the place was basically built on a marsh. Canals were constructed for irrigation, markets blossomed, and the city became the hub for what would eventually be called the Triple Alliance, the famous power trio of Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan. They weren't exactly best friends forever, but alliances were convenient for conquering neighbors, which the Aztecs did often, with gusto. And here's where hubris starts to creep in. Gently, like the first warm breeze of a summer afternoon. They had conquered a lot of surrounding city-states, imposed tributes, and generally convinced themselves that they were untouchable. Their religion helped. The gods demanded loyalty, sacrifice, and tribute, and it was all too easy to interpret that divine favor as proof of superiority. Of course they were the chosen people, because why not double down on that thought? Moctezuma I, the fifth ruler, was particularly interesting. He expanded the empire significantly. Under his reign, the Aztecs were practically unstoppable. He made alliances through marriage, implemented tribute systems that were annoyingly efficient, and took the Aztec religious system to new heights. Temples were built and expanded, priests had more power than some rulers in other cultures might have dreamed of, and the citizens? Well, they were busy keeping up with the bureaucracy, the markets, and occasionally the cosmic requirements for keeping the sun alive. No pressure. Now let's pause for a moment and consider the dynasty itself.
The Aztecs had a habit that historians find fascinating: marrying within their elite circles, often cousins or other distant relatives. This, unsurprisingly, sometimes produced rulers who were sickly or unstable, a pattern that would continue in Europe for centuries. But in the context of their time, inbreeding wasn't viewed as a biological hazard. It was simply a way to keep power consolidated, and so the cycle continued. You had brilliant, capable rulers, occasionally shadowed by those whose genetic luck wasn't quite up to par. As Tenochtitlan grew, so did its culture. Markets became legendary. Traders came from distant lands bringing exotic goods, jaguar pelts, brightly colored feathers, obsidian knives. You could get almost anything if you had the right number of cacao beans, which were basically the currency of the era. There were also artisans and scribes. Art was everywhere, from codices to temple carvings, often depicting the gods in ways that were both beautiful and a little terrifying. It was a sophisticated civilization, and all the while the leaders were consolidating power and prestige, which, in hindsight, is exactly how hubris creeps in. And then there's the religion. Oh, the religion. The Aztec pantheon was enormous and complicated, with deities for practically everything: Tlaloc for rain, Huitzilopochtli for war and the sun, Quetzalcoatl for learning and wind. Rituals were elaborate, ceremonies were frequent, and yes, they sometimes included human offerings, because what else do you do when the sun god is demanding attention on a hot afternoon? But these rituals were more than just superstition. They were social glue, a way to reinforce hierarchy, control labor, and, frankly, remind everyone who was in charge. Moctezuma I's grandson, Axayacatl, took the expansionist attitude to new heights. Under his rule, the Aztec Empire stretched even further. He also happened to be rather sensitive about his personal reputation, which led to some curious behaviors. For instance, he often appeared in public dressed in full ceremonial garb, even in situations where it wasn't strictly necessary. Imagine wearing a feathered headdress to a casual lunch. That was Axayacatl. And people, of course, loved to watch him perform the rituals. Partly out of reverence, partly because it was a little entertaining to see a grown man struggle with ceremonial sandals. By the time Moctezuma II arrived on the scene, Tenochtitlan was basically the center of the world for the Aztecs. Markets, canals, massive temples, and a complex bureaucracy all spoke of an empire at its peak. But Moctezuma II was also, in historical terms, what we might call a little too much. He was deeply religious, superstitious, and prone to bouts of paranoia. Reports suggest he had mood swings, sometimes acting magnanimous, other times retreating into his chambers for days. This personality quirk would become especially relevant when strangers from across the ocean showed up. But before we get to that, though, let's briefly explore the Aztec view of the outside world. The Mexica had heard of distant lands, but mostly in myth and legend. There were rumors of strange people beyond the seas, but no one expected them to arrive anytime soon. And honestly, Tenochtitlan had enough to worry about. Maintaining tribute from conquered peoples, keeping markets running smoothly, and ensuring that the priests didn't throw a fit over an overlooked ritual was more than enough to occupy anyone's day. Hubris was quietly growing, unnoticed, like a shadow, creeping across the plaza as the sun set. And, as is often the case with empires at their peak, they became somewhat predictable. Alliances expected favors, conquered city-states grumbled under tribute, and the ruling class occasionally forgot that the sun didn't always have to rise in their favor. Their military was strong, yes, but it was also rigid. They had grown accustomed to success, and when you grow accustomed to success, you stop imagining failure, even when it's gently nudging at the edges of your empire. So, as we drift toward the next phase of this story, let's appreciate the beauty, ambition, and complexity of Tenochtitlan. Canals weaving through the city, the hum of markets, the rhythmic chant of priests calling on the gods, and of course the subtle undercurrent of inevitability, which is what makes history so fascinating when you're lying down, trying to relax, and imagining a civilization at the peak of its power, utterly unaware of the storms gathering on the horizon. But before we reach that horizon, we have to meet a few more characters, because the Aztec story is as much about personalities as it is about monuments. Think of it as a slow parade of slightly neurotic kings, ambitious generals, and priests who may or may not have had too much caffeine. Each one contributed to the empire's rise, and each one, in their own way, added a small thread to the tapestry that would eventually unravel. We'll float over to another royal development in the next segment, the curious, sometimes baffling choices of Moctezuma II, and how a ruler's personality can shape the fate of an entire civilization. But for now, imagine the sun dipping over Tenochtitlan, reflecting off the canals, the hum of markets, and the rhythmic chant of priests calling on the gods. And of course, the subtle undercurrent of inevitability, which is what makes history so fascinating when you're lying down, trying to relax, and imagining a civilization at the peak of its power, utterly unaware of the storms gathering on the horizon.
Part 2. Moctezuma II and the Height of Hubris. Welcome back, everyone. If you're still with me, good. Settle in, maybe adjust that pillow, because we're about to drift deeper into the world of Tenochtitlan, right at the moment when things were, in historical terms, about as perfect as an empire can get, and about as fragile as a freshly baked tortilla. Now, Moctezuma II, or Moctezuma II, if you want to impress people at parties, was a complicated man. He came to power around 1502, a time when Tenochtitlan was essentially the crown jewel of Mesoamerica. Think about it. Huge markets, canals glinting in the sun, temples reaching for the sky, a bureaucracy that could rival some modern governments, and of course, a citizenry conditioned to respect, fear, and occasionally feed the gods. Moctezuma stepped into this world wearing a feathered headdress, a ceremonial cloak, and a very heavy sense of personal destiny. Now, Moctezuma II was ambitious, like maybe too ambitious. He expanded the empire's reach through both diplomacy and military campaigns. He demanded tributes, sometimes outrageous ones: jade, cacao, gold, exotic animals, even cloth that looked like it had been sewn by angels. And the conquered peoples complied, because Aztec armies were persuasive. The thing is, Moctezuma wasn't just content with conquest. He also wanted to centralize power. Before him, local rulers in conquered territories had some leeway, but he thought, why let them think they're important? Let's make it all about me. And so he reorganized the empire's provinces, installed loyal governors, and created a bureaucracy that probably made paperwork enthusiasts in 16th century Spain jealous. But here's the twist. Moctezuma was also paranoid. Not paranoid in the jumping at shadows way, although he did that too, but in a cosmic sense. He was obsessed with omens. Comets streaking across the sky? Bad news. Volcanic eruptions? Definitely bad. A hummingbird that looked at him funny. Probably the gods sending a subtle warning about some unplanned chaos. He believed that the universe itself might disapprove of him if he didn't get everything right. So he kept the priests happy, held rituals more elaborate than a Renaissance opera, and spent countless hours ensuring that his personal and political life aligned with divine will. Which, as you might imagine, made him an exhausting man to be around. His courtiers, while terrified, probably spent half their day just trying to figure out which mood Moctezuma was in. Sometimes he was generous and gracious. Other times he'd retreat into his palace for days, issuing proclamations only through intermediaries. People adapted, or they got nervous and prayed a lot. Meanwhile, life in the city went on. Markets thrived. The city's chinampas, the floating gardens, provided a surprisingly efficient agricultural system. Maize, beans, squash, basic staples that supported an ever-growing population flourished.
Artisans continued producing codices, pottery, and stunning featherwork. The city was a marvel. But as always, when everything seems perfect, hubris is quietly stretching its wings. Now, Moctezuma II also had a flair for self-importance, which is subtle in history, but rather obvious if you picture him in public ceremonies. He often dressed in extravagant outfits, which was unusual for royalty, except that he sometimes wore more feathers than was probably comfortable. Imagine a man balancing on his toes under a cascade of bright plumes, trying to look divine. And people, of course, watched and whispered, partly in admiration, partly thinking, is he going to fall over? But no one said it out loud. Fear will do that to a crowd. Now, during Moctezuma's reign, the Aztecs continued to expand their influence. Tribute lists grew, and the empire's wealth increased dramatically. But like any ruler at the peak of power, he started to believe that the empire was untouchable. The gods favored them, the armies were formidable, the markets were busy, and the canals were spotless, or at least as clean as a swamp-based city could manage. It's a classic pattern. Success feeds self-confidence, self-confidence nurtures hubris, and hubris quietly invites disaster. And then the rumors arrived. Tales of strange pale-skinned people beyond the ocean, riding giant animals, with weapons that spit fire, and wearing armor that gleamed in the sun. At first, these were just distant whispers. Moctezuma probably assumed they were exaggerations, or perhaps even divine omens in disguise. But over time, the stories persisted. Strange strangers with unknown intentions were coming closer. And Moctezuma, who was already predisposed to paranoia, interpreted these reports as cosmic signals. Let's not forget that the Aztec worldview was deeply symbolic. They had myths about returning gods and cycles of time that influenced how they interpreted the unexpected. And so when the first European ships approached the coast, some historians argue Moctezuma may have wondered if a god, perhaps Quetzalcoatl, had returned in a very inconvenient form, which, in hindsight, is a rather dramatic way to handle a first encounter with foreigners, but it fit the times. Before we get to the fateful meeting, though, it's worth examining the internal tensions. Not everyone in the empire was thrilled about Moctezuma's centralized control or the tribute demands. City-states and local leaders grumbled quietly, or sometimes not so quietly. The Aztec military was strong but stretched thin, managing far-flung territories. And as anyone running an empire can tell you, resentment accumulates faster than you realize. Hubris doesn't just blind rulers to external threats, it also makes them blind to simmering internal problems. Moctezuma's personality didn't help. He was a devout man, deeply committed to ritual and the will of the gods. Some accounts suggest he withdrew from active decision-making when things became uncertain, letting priests and advisors take over daily government, which, from a calm bedtime historian perspective, is fascinating. Imagine an emperor pacing in his palace, mumbling prayers, while generals are outside wondering who's actually in charge today. It's a recipe for subtle chaos. And now we arrive at the Europeans. Hernán Cortés and his small band of conquistadors landed on the Gulf Coast in 1519, which is, if you ask Moctezuma II, was probably not what he expected to see on a normal morning. Cortés was audacious, clever, and possibly delusional. He immediately began forming alliances with discontented city-states, exploiting resentment that the Aztecs had cultivated for decades. Smallpox, which would later devastate the population, wasn't his plan, but it was about to make history even more tragic. The first meetings between Moctezuma and Cortés are the stuff of legend, although the details are always fuzzy, partly because everyone had slightly different agendas in writing them down later. Some say Moctezuma treated Cortés as a returning god. Others argue he was attempting to buy time, unsure of what these strangers really wanted. Either way, he welcomed them into Tenochtitlan. Temples continued to function, markets remained busy, and citizens went about their daily lives, perhaps suspicious, but mostly bewildered by the sudden arrival of pale men with shining armor. Moctezuma's hubris shows up again here. He believed that displaying wealth, generosity, and divine favor would keep these strangers respectful. Gold was offered, feasts were arranged, and rituals continued as if to say, "Look, everything is fine. The gods are on our side. Surely you mean no harm," which is a reasonable approach if you assume the visitors play by the same cosmic rules. They didn't. And here is where history starts to float toward tragedy like a boat on a calm lake, unaware of the rocks just below the surface. Inside the palace, Moctezuma struggled with his decisions. Some advisors urged caution, others argued for aggression. But he had a tendency to freeze when things became uncertain, preferring prayer to action. And the city, dazzling as it was, began to feel the tension. Tributes were still being collected, markets still ran, but the undercurrent of fear was now palpable. Citizens whispered about the strangers. Rumors about invisible sicknesses and strange weapons spread. And Moctezuma's authority, while outwardly intact, was subtly undermined. And then came the inevitable. Cortés took Moctezuma hostage. Now, this is a scene historians often describe with a hint of disbelief. Imagine your ruler, a man who has expanded an empire, commanded armies, and presided over magnificent rituals, suddenly reduced to a puppet for foreign interests. He continued to advise, perhaps hoping his compliance would protect his people, but his authority evaporated in ways that even he probably didn't fully understand. Hubris, after all, cannot protect you from the unforeseen, and sometimes all the wealth and divine favor in the world is useless against a determined...
Part 3. The Fall of Tenochtitlan. All right, friends, settle back in. By now, we've floated through the rise of Tenochtitlan, watched the Aztecs expand their empire, and met Moctezuma II, an emperor equal parts devout, paranoid, and spectacularly overconfident. If you've managed to keep your eyelids from drifting closed, good, because now we gently glide into the slow unraveling of one of history's most fascinating cities. And don't worry, there won't be any sudden screaming chaos, just a steady, quiet, almost tragic erosion of power, like sugar dissolving in warm water. So, let's pick up where we left off. Cortés had taken Moctezuma hostage. The emperor, once the ruler of a glittering empire, now existed in a strange, constrained space, caught between duty to his people and obedience to these strange, armored foreigners. To outsiders, it might have looked like a subtle game of chess. To Moctezuma, it probably felt more like being trapped in a decorative cage with too many eyes and far too much gold. At first, the city continued to function. Markets remained busy. The chinampas, the floating gardens, continued to produce maize, beans, and squash. Priests performed their rituals with quiet precision, ensuring the gods were not upset. And the people? Well, they whispered, a little nervously, wondering when things would truly go wrong. But, as often happens, hubris makes people overconfident even when circumstances are tense. After all, Tenochtitlan had survived droughts, rebellions, and wars before. Surely it could survive a few strangers with shiny armor. Except, of course, that it couldn't. The first major disruption came when Cortés left the city for a while to confront Spanish authorities elsewhere. In his absence, tensions exploded. The Aztec citizens realized their ruler was no longer fully in command. Moctezuma had become a symbol rather than a decision-maker. His authority, carefully maintained for decades, unraveled almost overnight. There was confusion, unrest, and, in the traditional pattern of empire, a little bit of blame, because when things go wrong, humans always need a target. And then came smallpox. Not intentionally brought by Cortés, but rather carried unknowingly by the Europeans. Smallpox arrived like an invisible tide, sweeping through the city. It didn't discriminate. Priests, nobles, merchants, children, all vulnerable. People who had once walked the streets with confidence now succumbed to a disease that left skins scarred and bodies weak. Imagine the bustling plazas suddenly emptying, the air thick with worry, the scent of illness drifting across the canals. The empire's population, which had been its greatest strength, became a source of vulnerability. The siege itself began in earnest once Cortés returned, accompanied by reinforcements. The Spanish, along with their indigenous allies who resented Aztec rule, began surrounding the city. Tenochtitlan, built on a series of islands in Lake Texcoco, had natural defenses, but siege warfare is exhausting. Canals that once brought water and trade now became obstacles. Supplies were cut off. Disease spread further. And the Aztecs, despite their fierce fighting spirit, were increasingly weakened by a combination of smallpox, starvation, and psychological strain. Moctezuma II by this point had been dead for some time. Some say at the hands of his own people, angry and desperate. Others claim the Spanish killed him. Regardless, his absence left a leadership vacuum. His successors, though brave, were caught in an impossible situation, defending a city under siege by technologically advanced invaders, while their population dwindled and internal morale collapsed. Hubris had led the empire to assume it was untouchable, and now reality quietly corrected that assumption. The Aztec resistance was tenacious, of course. There were ambushes, counterattacks, and clever maneuvers across the canals. Floating bridges were destroyed, causeways barricaded. But every move was more desperate than strategic, because attrition, smallpox, starvation, and exhaustion was steadily wearing them down. The city that once seemed invincible now resembled a delicate structure under stress, slowly cracking at the seams. And then there's the human element, which historians love because it reminds us that history isn't just about dates and battles, it's about people reacting to extreme circumstances. Citizens of Tenochtitlan were starving. Families hid in fear. Some priests continued rituals, perhaps as a way to impose normalcy or simply because habit is hard to break. And nobles debated strategy while trying to maintain a veneer of dignity. You can almost hear the quiet frustration. We built canals and temples, we followed the gods, we collected tribute, and now we are surrounded by men who ride strange animals and carry thunder in their hands. What did we do wrong? By the summer of 1521, the siege reached its final phase. Canals were filled with debris, causeways had become battlegrounds, and the Spaniards, leveraging their alliances with enemies of the Aztecs, advanced steadily. The city, brilliant and complex, was now under relentless pressure. Hubris, which had seemed so protective in earlier decades, now made the fall all the more dramatic. The Aztecs had assumed that divine favor and military might would be sufficient. They had assumed that no outsider could dismantle the careful web of power they had woven. And yet, here they were, seeing it unravel before their eyes. It's worth noting that the fall was not immediate, not cinematic in the Hollywood sense. It was prolonged, drawn out, and exhausting. Buildings burned, supplies ran out, and the social fabric frayed. By the time the final assault occurred, Tenochtitlan had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. Streets that once hummed with life were quiet. Temples that scraped the sky were damaged, their grandeur diminished by fire and neglect. And the citizens, once proud and confident, were left to confront a future they could scarcely imagine. The psychological impact of the siege cannot be understated. Human resilience has limits, and Tenochtitlan had reached them. Children, artisans, farmers, and warriors all faced the combined toll of disease, hunger, and loss of leadership. Panic spread faster than any army could move. People who had once trusted their rulers now questioned every command. Social cohesion, carefully nurtured over generations, unraveled. In short, hubris had lulled an entire population into believing in their invincibility, and reality, quietly but inexorably, corrected that misjudgment. When the final breach occurred, the Spanish entered a city that was, by then, eerily silent in comparison to its previous vibrancy. Markets were largely empty, temples damaged, and the few remaining defenders exhausted and demoralized. Resistance continued in pockets, but the empire that once commanded loyalty across hundreds of city-states was effectively over.
What remained was a memory of grandeur, a few surviving nobles, and, of course, stories that would travel across the seas to Europe, astonishing people who had never imagined such sophistication could exist outside the Mediterranean. And let's pause here, not for drama, but for perspective.
Part 4. Legacy, Hubris, and the Quiet Lessons of the Aztecs. Welcome back for the final drift through our story of the Aztecs. By now, we've watched Tenochtitlan rise from a swampy island, observed Moctezuma II's hubris in full swing, and floated gently through the slow, inexorable fall of one of history's most fascinating cities. So let's lean back, exhale, and explore what happened after the smoke cleared. The canals were choked with debris, and the market squares grew quiet. Because history doesn't end with the last battle. It continues, quietly, in memory, culture, and sometimes in the lessons it whispers to us centuries later. After the fall in 1521, Tenochtitlan was no longer the vibrant capital of a sprawling empire. Cortés and his Spanish allies rebuilt it as Mexico City, carefully incorporating the foundations, streets, and canals of the old city into a new colonial framework. Temples that had scraped the sky were demolished or repurposed into cathedrals. Canals that had once carried floating gardens now accommodated Spanish transport and commerce. And yet, despite this deliberate overriding, traces of the old Aztec world lingered, not in the grandeur of the temples or the monuments, but in the memory of the people, in the codices that survived, and in cultural practices that refused to vanish entirely. The surviving Aztec nobility found themselves in strange circumstances. Some were co-opted into the Spanish colonial system as intermediaries, their previous status reduced but not entirely erased. Others were absorbed into local communities, carrying their knowledge, traditions, and religious practices quietly, often blending them with imposed European customs. And the citizens? Life went on, as it always does. Markets reopened, families rebuilt homes, children played near the same canals their ancestors had tended. But the aura of empire, the careful web of tribute, ritual, and hierarchical control was gone. From a broader perspective, the fall of Tenochtitlan illustrates the subtle dangers of hubris, not the kind of hubris that leads to an immediate explosion, but the quiet, creeping kind that convinces a civilization of its invulnerability. The Aztecs had excelled in architecture, agriculture, military organization, and diplomacy. They had mastered the art of weaving political power and religious authority into a system that appeared nearly perfect. But in assuming that their gods, armies, and societal structures could protect them against the unexpected, foreign invaders, disease, internal unrest, they overestimated their resilience. Hubris, in this sense, is not loud. It's a gentle lullaby that convinces people that they are untouchable until they are not. Interestingly, the Aztec story did not vanish entirely. Their cultural legacy continues in subtle, sometimes surprising ways. Corn, beans, and squash, the staples of their chinampas, remain central to Mexican cuisine. Artistic motifs, featherwork, and mythological stories have endured, preserved in oral traditions and codices. Even the city layout influenced the urban planning of colonial Mexico City. And of course, the story of Moctezuma II, the eagle on the cactus, and the canals of Tenochtitlan continued to capture imaginations worldwide. The empire may have fallen, but its memory persists as a quietly powerful testament to human ambition and complexity. The downfall also serves as a meditation on leadership and human psychology. Moctezuma II's personality, devout, meticulous, paranoid, and occasionally indecisive, shaped the empire's final years. His hubris, compounded by reverence for divine signals, created a paradox. He believed himself protected by the gods, while increasingly trapped by human events. When Cortés arrived, Moctezuma attempted to maintain control through ritual, diplomacy, and generosity. None of it mattered in the face of disease, internal tension, and strategic alliances formed by the Spanish. This illustrates a broader historical lesson. Even brilliant systems, guided by capable leaders, can fail if they are built on assumptions that fail to account for randomness and human unpredictability. And yet, the story of Tenochtitlan is not purely tragic. There is something quietly inspiring about the city at its peak. The canals, the floating gardens, the bustling markets, the temples towering into the sky. The Aztecs created an intricate civilization in a challenging environment, blending engineering, agriculture, commerce, religion, and art into a coherent, functioning society. They mastered swamps and marshes, turned a lake into a capital, and sustained it for nearly 2 centuries. Their achievements remind us that human ingenuity is remarkable, even when ambition nudges us toward overconfidence. From a modern perspective, the fall of Tenochtitlan also invites reflection on resilience. Empires collapse, yes, but the cultural threads that survive can be surprisingly durable. Language, art, food, religion, and collective memory often outlive political structures. In the case of the Aztecs, though the empire fell, their traditions, knowledge, and stories remained embedded in the landscape and among the people. The empire's decline may be an example of failure in power, but the persistence of culture reminds us that human creativity and memory have a resilience that transcends conquest. The Aztec example also gently illuminates the interplay between internal and external forces in history. Internally, tensions between rulers and subjects, disease outbreaks, and over-centralization contributed to fragility. Externally, unforeseen threats, Cortés, his allies, and smallpox accelerated the collapse. This duality is crucial for understanding history's quiet, almost meditative rhythm. No single factor dictates outcomes. Empires rise and fall through a complex mixture of human choices, natural events, and sheer chance. And as we reflect on Tenochtitlan, it becomes clear that hubris is often the silent partner that allows seemingly stable systems to unravel. It's also worth noting the irony in how we remember the Aztecs. European narratives historically emphasized the conquest, heroic Spaniards overcoming barbaric, quote, savage peoples, unquote. Yet, the Aztec civilization was sophisticated, technologically adept, and culturally rich. They had writing systems, calendars, complex engineering, and an intricate political network. In many ways, the conquest underscores not just European ambition, but also the fragility that comes from overconfidence and misjudged assumptions. The Aztecs were brilliant, but they were also human, and humans, no matter how talented, have limits. And as you float along with this tale, consider the subtle, almost philosophical takeaways. Hubris is not always loud or dramatic. It doesn't always show up as arrogance in a single person. Sometimes it's the quiet, cumulative effect of centuries of success, a society lulled into believing in its invulnerability. Tenochtitlan teaches us that the greatest strength can hide the seeds of failure.
that brilliance does not guarantee permanence, and that the unexpected, whether disease, outside contact, or internal rebellion, can quietly, inexorably shift the course of history. We can also reflect on Moctezuma II as a symbol of this dynamic, a ruler capable of extraordinary feats, yet trapped by his beliefs, personality, and the limitations of his time. His story is less about failure in a dramatic, cinematic sense, and more about the subtle consequences of human psychology and social systems. Paranoia, overconfidence, ritual obsession, and indecision all played roles. The empire, magnificent and formidable, could not withstand these pressures when combined with external threats. But as we reflect Tenochtitlan, there is a kind of quiet dignity in the Aztec legacy. Their codices, which survived despite the destruction, contain exquisite records of daily life, ritual, and governance. Archaeological sites reveal the ingenuity of their city planning and agriculture.